August 3rd, 1941. St. Lamberti Church, Münster. The air inside the cathedral pressed heavy and hot despite the morning hour. Bodies packed every pew, every aisle, spilling through the doorways onto the cobblestones outside. 1,000 faces turned toward the pulpit, perhaps more. No one had seen a crowd like this since the war began. They stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same thick air, sharing the same suffocating question. Would he dare? Bishop Clemens August von Galen climbed the pulpit steps slowly, each footfall echoing against stone. He was 63 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his face carved from granite and conscience. The silk vestments caught the filtered light from the stained glass windows. His hands gripped the pulpit rail. In the fourth row, 3 men sat motionless in civilian clothes. Their faces were blank. Their notebooks were ready. Everyone knew what they were. Everyone knew they were listening. What no one knew was whether the bishop would cross the line from which there could be no return. The congregation fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of Sunday worship, but the breathless silence of people standing at the edge of an abyss, waiting to see if someone they loved would jump or be pushed. Von Galen had been born into nobility in 1878, the 11th of 13 children in an ancient German family. His ancestors had been counts and princes, warriors and statesmen, but young Clemens August had chosen a different path. At 26, he'd been ordained a priest. For nearly 3 decades, he'd served in parishes among the poor and working class, hearing confessions in factory towns, baptizing the children of miners, burying the broken bodies of men crushed by industrial machinery. He learned that aristocratic blood meant nothing if it didn't flow toward service. He learned that truth spoken gently could be ignored, but truth spoken clearly could never be unheard. When the church appointed him Bishop of Münster in October 1933, he'd walked into his cathedral on the same day that darkness was descending over Germany. Adolf Hitler had seized power 9 months earlier. The Enabling Act had shredded the Constitution. The first concentration camps had already opened. And von Galen, taking his seat in the episcopal throne, had looked out at his flock and understood the wolves were circling. At first, he'd tried diplomacy, letters to officials, private meetings, careful protests. He watched as Catholic schools were shuttered, as priests were arrested on fabricated charges of immorality and currency smuggling, as monasteries and convents were seized by men in leather coats who smiled while they stole. He'd written pastoral letters. He'd argued with bureaucrats. He'd appealed to whatever remained of German decency. Nothing worked. The machine kept grinding forward, devouring everything in its path. Then, in the winter of 1940, families began appearing at his residence after dark. A father, hat in hand, voice breaking. "Your Excellency, my daughter. They took her from the institution. They said she died of pneumonia, but she was healthy when we visited last month." A mother, weeping. "They sent me an urn, just an urn. They wouldn't let me see him before. More families came, more stories, all the same. Disabled children disappearing from care facilities, elderly relatives dying suddenly, death certificates with suspicious diagnoses, ashes returned in sealed containers, questions met with silence or threats." Von Galen began his own investigation. Catholic nurses came to him in secret, their faces pale with horror, their hands shaking as they described what they'd witnessed in the institutions. Patients taken away in grey buses, rooms that filled with gas, bodies burned in basement furnaces. A doctor, risking everything, brought him documents, forms, signatures, protocols. A bureaucracy of murder, systematized and sanctioned. The Nazi regime was killing its own citizens, the disabled, the mentally ill, the elderly, anyone deemed life unworthy of life. They called it mercy. They called it medical procedure. They called it anything except what it was, murder. Von Galen spent nights on his knees in his private chapel, the weight of terrible knowledge crushing down on his shoulders. If he spoke publicly, he would likely be arrested. The Gestapo had killed bishops before, not in Germany yet, but in Poland, in the occupied territories. They could disappear him into a camp. They could stage an accident. They could simply shoot him and call it lawful execution. But if he stayed silent, the killing would continue, and his silence would be consent. On July 6, 1941, the Gestapo stormed the Jesuit college in Münster. They expelled the priests and brothers, confiscated the property, and turned the building over to the Nazi Party. Within days, they seized 2 convents. Religious sisters, some elderly, were forced into the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the rosaries in their pockets. Von Galen made his decision. The time for careful diplomacy was over. On July 13th, he preached his first open challenge. Standing in St. Lamberti, he declared that no German citizen was safe from arbitrary arrest, from confiscation of property, from imprisonment without trial. The Gestapo agents in attendance scribbled furiously. The congregation listened in stunned silence. Word spread through the city like fire through dry grass. The bishop has spoken. A week later, July 20th, he preached again. This time he attacked the foundation of Nazi power itself, declaring that no human authority, not the Führer, not the Reich, not any earthly power could override the law of God. Man-made law must bow to divine law, or it became tyranny. The noose was tightening. Von Galen could feel it. Gestapo surveillance increased. His mail was intercepted. His associates were questioned. He knew that somewhere in Berlin, in the Reich Chancellery or the Propaganda Ministry or Gestapo headquarters, men in uniforms were discussing what to do about the troublesome bishop in Münster. He didn't care. Or rather, he cared desperately, but he cared more about the truth, which brought him here. August 3rd, 1941. St. Lamberti Church. The pulpit, the crowd, the Gestapo agents with their notebooks, and the sermon he'd spent the past week writing, rewriting, praying over, preparing to deliver. He began speaking. His voice was steady, clear, carrying to the farthest corners of the packed cathedral. He spoke about the 5th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." He spoke about human dignity, about the image of God stamped on every human soul, about the sacred worth of every life, from conception to natural death. Then he went where no bishop in Germany had yet dared to go. He described what was happening in German institutions at that very moment. Buses arriving at hospitals and care facilities, patients selected according to lists, people loaded into vehicles with covered windows, transported to killing centers, murdered with poison gas, their bodies burned, their families lied to. He didn't use euphemisms. He called it murder. If it is once admitted, von Galen declared, his voice rising, that men have the right to kill unproductive fellow men, even though it is at present applied only to poor and defenseless mentally ill patients, then the way is open for the murder of all unproductive men and women, the incurably ill, the handicapped who are unable to work, those disabled in industry or war. He paused. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. Outside, even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The way is open, he continued, for the murder of all of us when we become old and infirm and therefore unproductive. Women wept openly. Men clenched their fists. The Gestapo agents wrote faster, their faces rigid with fury. Everyone in that cathedral knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, an open denunciation of state policy, a bishop naming the regime itself as murderer, a man placing his life on the altar of truth. Von Galen's voice rang out like a bell. Woe to mankind, woe to our German people. If the divine commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," which the Lord proclaimed on Sinai amid thunder and lightning, which God our Creator wrote into the conscience of man from the beginning, is not only violated, but if this violation is actually tolerated and permitted to go unpunished. He urged his listeners to remove their relatives from institutions if possible. He called them to resist. He warned that Germany was bringing divine judgment upon itself. When he finished, he descended from the pulpit in silence. The Mass continued. Communion was distributed. Benediction was given. And then the people began to leave, some stopping to kiss his ring, others too overcome with emotion to speak, many weeping. The Gestapo agents left quickly. They had a report to file. By nightfall, typewriters were clattering in homes across Münster. Hands were copying the sermon, word for word. By the next morning, copies were on trains heading to every corner of Germany. Within a week, soldiers at the front were reading it in their trenches. Within 2 weeks, The Royal Air Force had obtained a copy, printed thousands more, and dropped them from bombers over German cities. The Reich could not contain it. The truth had escaped. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler raged. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote furiously in his diary about the treasonous bishop. Martin Bormann demanded immediate arrest and execution. Heinrich Himmler prepared the orders. But the regime hesitated. Münster was overwhelmingly Catholic. If they arrested the bishop, would the city riot? Would Catholic soldiers on the Eastern Front desert? Would they create a martyr whose witness would be more powerful than his preaching? They decided to wait. After the war, they told themselves, after victory, they would settle accounts with von Galen and all the other enemies of the Reich. But von Galen didn't know they'd decided to wait. He only knew that every morning when he woke, every knock on the door, every car that stopped outside his residence might be the Gestapo coming to arrest him. He packed a small bag, a Bible, his breviary, a rosary, one change of clothes. He prepared his will. He said goodbye to his cathedral staff, not knowing if he would see them again. The darkest hours came in the weeks after the sermon, when reports reached him of others suffering because of his words. A family arrested for possessing a typed copy. A priest interrogated for reading the sermon from his pulpit. A young woman, barely 20, beaten by Gestapo agents who found the sermon hidden in her room. Von Galen knelt alone in his chapel one night, the weight of their suffering crushing down on him. Had he done right? Had his courage caused more harm than good? Was speaking truth worth the price others were paying? The candle before the tabernacle flickered. Outside, air raid sirens wailed. The city was dark. He was alone with his doubt and his God. "Father," he prayed, "if this cup cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. But protect them. Protect those who trusted me." No answer came from heaven, only silence. But in the silence, von Galen found what he needed. Not certainty, but the resolve to continue. He had spoken the truth. If God called him to die for it, he would die, but he would not recant. Morning came. The Gestapo did not come. Not that day, not the next. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Von Galen continued his ministry, always under the shadow of the sword, always waiting for the knock on the door that would mean his martyrdom. And then, 3 weeks after his sermon, something extraordinary happened. On August 24, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued an order. The Aktion T4 euthanasia program was to be officially halted. The killing centers closed. The grey buses stopped running. The systematic murder of the disabled ended not completely, not permanently, but the industrial machinery of death ground to a halt. Historians would later debate the causes: public unrest, Catholic protest, fear of resistance, the need to maintain morale for the war effort. Many factors contributed. But everyone knew. The Lion of Münster had roared, and the Reich had blinked. Tens of thousands of lives, perhaps more, were saved. People who would have been murdered in the fall of 1941, in 1942, in 1943, lived instead. Children grew up who would have been killed. Elderly men and women died natural deaths in their own time, not in gas chambers. The exact number will never be known, but the voice of one bishop, armed with nothing but moral authority and the truth, had wounded a genocidal program. Von Galen lived under threat until the war's end. When Allied bombs devastated Münster, he refused to evacuate, ministering instead to the wounded and dying in the rubble. When the Gestapo, in the chaotic final days of April 1945, drew up lists of enemies to execute before the Americans arrived, his name was on them. He survived only because the regime collapsed before they could act. Liberation came. Germany surrendered. The nightmare ended. In February 1946, Pope Pius XII elevated Clemens August von Galen to the College of Cardinals in recognition of his courage. Von Galen traveled to Rome, received the Red Hat, and returned to Münster to overwhelming celebration. The Lion had triumphed. 1 month later, he was dead. An intestinal infection, sudden and severe. Some whispered of poison, of unrepentant Nazis seeking revenge. Nothing was ever proven. More likely, it was simply his time, a body worn down by years of stress, fear, and service finally giving out. He was 68 years old. Thousands attended his funeral. Germany mourned, the church mourned, but his voice did not fall silent. In October 2005, nearly 60 years after his death, Pope Benedict XVI beatified Clemens August von Galen. Blessed Clemens August, the Lion of Münster, the bishop who stood in a pulpit on a summer morning in 1941 and chose truth over safety, courage over comfort, life over silence. His sermons are still read, his example still inspires, and the question he answered with his life still echoes across the decades. When evil becomes law, when murder becomes policy, when silence becomes complicity, will you speak? Will you stand? Will you roar? One man did, armed with nothing but words and conscience, facing down the most murderous regime in modern history. He opened his mouth and truth came out. And in that moment, in that cathedral, in that city, the darkness trembled. Because light, once lit, cannot be extinguished, and truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, and courage, once chosen, becomes a legacy that outlives empires. The Lion of Münster proved that even in hell, even facing certain death, even standing alone, one voice speaking truth can shake the world.